You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I'd like to introduce to the show today our first guest, and Alvaro Vargas Llosa is the Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute, and he's also the author of Global Crossings, Immigration, Civilization, and America, which is a new book and on such an important topic. Alvaro, welcome to the Final Say Radio Show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, first thing I always want to ask anyone who takes the tremendous effort it takes to write any book, and because I know it's a significant undertaking, especially when most authors have other things that they're working on. You know, in your case, it could be with the Independent Institute and all the other things that you do in your life. But what made you take on this particular topic in this particular book?
Well, I guess many things. One is my personal experience. I've been living in this country for a number of years. Before this, I was also based in Europe for a while. My country of origin is Peru. So this is kind of something that comes, I guess, naturally to me. The other thing that I think was very important in my decision was just observing the evolution of this conversation, of this discussion in the United States. I think that as time has passed, this issue has become more laden with myth and misperception. And I thought it might be something I could make a contribution to, because I've been thinking and researching and writing about this for quite a while. So it's kind of my small contribution to this huge discussion.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned the word conversation, because I think that not just this issue, but all issues, especially when we look at Washington, D.C., we don't have conversations. We don't have dialogue. We have a group of members, usually a small portion, who draft a bill, have input from wherever they decide to get input from, put together some monstrosity of a bill, and then they present it to us as if we have a say in what's going to happen to our future. And I think that the word conversation and involving the Americans and people gets left out of the equation there. But I have to ask you, and you've pointed this out. It used to be here, we looked at America as a melting pot. Every American at some point was an immigrant. We all came here from somewhere else, except for Native Americans, but I'm sure at some point they came from somewhere else. But this goes back thousands and thousands of years. So here we are as a nation for, a little over 230 years, somewhere around there. And we're a nation of immigrants, but the conversation now is getting a little more divisive, and a lot of people are more skeptical and critical of what's going on. And the question I have for you is, does this have to do with the fact that we've had so much illegal immigration?
Probably that is a factor, but even before that, I think there's something that people need to realize, which is that at various points in U.S. history, this has also been the case. This was always a very divisive issue in the past. For instance, in the early 20th century, when the first, significantly restrictive law was put in place, 1924, that was really a reaction against the influx of Central and Southern Europeans in the previous 40, 50 years. Until then, most of the immigrants had come from Northern and Western Europe. But between 1880 and the 1920s, it was mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans, so very different people, culturally, and they even looked different. So people were very worried, very scared. They didn't really know what to make of this. And so there was a huge backlash against it that eventually reflected itself in this law. So this is not new. It has happened before. I think that at this point, a number of things are at play here. One is the nature of the world we live in. It's people are still getting adapted to globalization, to the kinds of disruptions that new technologies bring, and to a world in which free trade, which is expanding, has, to an extent, been a factor in an increase in the number of people crossing borders too. So all of this context is just one of, I think, one that brings or instills a bit of insecurity in people. So clearly, in this context, something like having 11 or 12 million people operating in the shadows illegally is going to be something that calls people's attention, clearly.
Yeah. Now, in your research and your studies on this topic, why are people immigrating to America, and are the reasons different today than they were, in past times?
Well, not really. I mean, if you ask, most people would say probably they think it's purely economic, and certainly the economy has to do with it. People want a better job. People want better living conditions, but that's not the overriding issue, and it's a much more mixed picture, really. You have everything. I mean, everything from literally just adventure to family ties to distressful conditions at home, and by that I don't mean economic, I mean political or so. And then historical ties. I mean, the U.S. has been entangled historically, of course, for various reasons in different countries across the world, around the world, and that has created this migratory dynamic. I mean, the U.S. Gets a lot of Filipino immigration. It has for decades now. That goes back to the end of the 19th century and the war. And again, in the Second World War, the U.S. established a program for nurses and encouraged immigration from the Philippines. In the case of Mexico, I mean, the first immigrants really came in the early 20th century because U.S. business interests that were linked to railroad construction were desperate for workers from overseas. So they went to Mexico and literally brought them from Mexico, kind of enticed them to come here. Dominican immigration. The U.S. occupied the Dominican Republic in 1916, and those links, of course, became everlasting. So even until this day, there's just a huge connection between the small country of the Dominican Republic and the huge country of the United States. So there are all sorts of reasons, and in these cases that I mentioned, history really is probably the overriding reason. I mean, you've got poorer countries than the ones that in which immigration originates. Immigration to the United States or in the United States, and yet they don't export people to the United States because they don't have the kinds of historical ties that some of these other countries do have.
Now, you've made a lot of different arguments and provided different details in your book here. So I have a few questions. The first would be, what impact, and because a lot of the argument today in dealing with the immigration bill is that of economics. And so when we look at this, what impact is immigration having on the wages and standard of living for American workers who are here?
Well, think about it just in domestic terms. I mean, between the Second World War and today, about 100 million people have been added to the workforce, just counting baby boomers and women in particular, who, of course, joined the workforce in these last few decades on a massive scale. And that never created any kind of long-term unemployment. I mean, the U.S. has had unemployment, of course, before in times of recession, but generally speaking, there's been no significant long-term unemployment. And if that had been if that sort of addition to the workforce, 100 million people, was something that had caused a major economic disruption and unemployment, or a significant impact on wages, it just simply wouldn't be the case that the U.S. economy has become more prosperous in the last half century or 60 years, that the real wages have gone up, and that unemployment has been relatively low. So if you think of international immigration in similar terms, then it's probably easier to understand what the effect is. I mean, what happens is, of course, immigrants, by definition, are both producers and consumers, so they add production to the economy. In terms of wages, they impact wages at the very, very low end of the scale. but only in a tiny way. We did extensive research on this. Our estimate is that it's no more than 1.5%, but that's immediately offset by the fact that people, because of this influx of immigrants at the low end of the scale, are able to move up the scale. I mean native-born Americans, and that offsets the tiny negative impact to the effect that the net effect is a plus 1.8%. Of course, as well as that, you have to take into account the fact that immigrants make those services less expensive than they would otherwise be, and therefore everybody else, the rest of society, benefits in terms of lower prices. In other words, as consumers.
Yeah, there's two parts of this argument that, not what you just said, but things that I've heard that really bother me over time. One is that when one side or the other makes the argument, we need to bring people from other places to do the jobs that Americans don't want to do. I always viewed that as actually offensive, because you're making a statement and publicly that this job's beneath us, let's go find somebody else to do it for us. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, frankly, I'll tell you that people in my family, when times were desperate, they took on any job they could find just to ensure that they could pay for their bills and support their family. And there's no, I guess sometimes you just have to do jobs that might not be as neat and clean as others, but it's still a job, and you're being paid for doing something that somebody needs. But I do think that it's an offensive way to talk about it, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting point that you make. It's never been the case that no American wanted certain types of jobs. So even when you've had immigrants take up most of the jobs in a certain industry or of a certain kind in terms of wages, even in such situations, you've always had a significant number of native people born in America, taking those jobs too. But it's really a question of thinking of the economy in dynamic terms. I mean, people generally want to move up at some point. People always expect that there will be some kind of upward mobility. And the only thing that actually allows that process to take place is to have a permanent influx of people wanting to do the jobs that you were comfortable doing at some point, but that now you would like to leave behind because you would like to move up, which doesn't mean that there won't be any other natives who will want to take those jobs. There will always be some. But generally speaking, what this does is it keeps the process dynamic, and it keeps it moving. The same thing, incidentally, happens with immigrants. When they come in and they take these low-paying jobs, a few years later, they themselves expect to move up, and what helps that process through is having more people come in at the lower end. Ultimately, though, there's no given number of jobs at the lower end of the scale, because that really depends very much on how many people are there for the taking. In other words, it's potentially limitless. It's just simply if nothing stands in the way of demand meeting supply, eventually you could have an expansion of those services and those industries beyond what happens now. So in all sorts of ways, I think this is just something that's very dynamic, and really we shouldn't think of it in just kind of static terms.
And now I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do so, I'm going to give you one area where this has definitely benefited us, and that is I used to be involved in the construction and building industry, and I know a lot of foreigners from not just South and Central America, but from other places around the world as well. There was a great need for stone workers, people who could work with stone and granite and marble and similar types of products. And where there weren't as many Americans who were skilled in this area, there were foreigners who were, and there was a need, and this need was filled. But in your book, Global Crossings, now you know that a lot of immigrants possess not just skills, but a unique entrepreneurial spirit and a work ethic. Could you explain why this is the case and how it benefits us and the competitiveness of the United States?
Sure. It's always been the case. I mean, not just in the United States and not just with a type of immigrant. I mean, say Hispanics. I mean, just everywhere. The Hispanic work ethic and just outlook on life is really almost always one that is based on self-reliance, effort, and entrepreneurship. It's just the nature of the beast. If you move somewhere else where you don't have many roots, where you don't know many people, where you are competing against people who are, at least to begin with, in a much more competitive position than you are, you're always going to strive to be equal to them or better than them. It's just again, the nature of things. However, I mean, beyond that, the actual fact is that any way you look at it, immigrants are very entrepreneurial. One way to look at it is to look at self-employment rates. The rate of self-employment among immigrants today almost matches the rate for Americans. It's about 12%. If you look at let's say, the number of companies that have been created by immigrants, say just before the bursting of the bubble, between say the mid 90s and the middle of the 2000 decade, we're talking about more than 500,000 jobs that were created directly, and many more indirectly, and just Silicon Valley. I mean, we all know what Indians and Chinese immigrants have done to that industry. So generally, yes, I mean it's a huge contribution. One of the things that I'm kind of critical of in the book is the fact that the system. I mean, this is going to change with the new bill if it passes, but until recently, I mean, the system was such that the quota for H-1B visas, in other words, for high-skilled visas, would be exhausted on day one as soon as they were open for applications. Because, well, the ceiling, I think the cap was about 65,000. And clearly there was a much greater demand than the system allowed for. So that's something that ultimately, I think, hurt the economy of the United States, because clearly those people would have had to go somewhere else, and the U.S. would have missed the opportunity of just bring these people into the economic process.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I know in one of the businesses I'm involved in, we experience that as well, and you see so much outsourcing that goes on, which would otherwise be done here in the United States. And by the way, if people were here working those jobs, it would also be tax revenues to the various governments that where people lived, and I think there are other areas that it would benefit us.
That's correct. I mean, it's an irony, but many people who studied here, went back to their countries, and then the U.S. U.S. companies outsourced to them overseas some of the jobs that they would have outsourced and functions they would have actually performed locally if these people had stayed. I'm sure.
And the technology and the knowledge and the know-how goes back to those countries instead of staying here as well. One final question, if I could ask. What are your thoughts on and do you support a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants? And if so, which pathway would you support?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we're never going to see on CNN, 12 million people marching down the border and across the border into Mexico. It's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. So, I think the country really needs to come to grips with the fact that ultimately, they're going, people are going to have to be legalized. The issue is how is that done in a way that's efficient and also within the context of a law that will not generate more illegal, undocumented immigrants in the future, which is what previous amnesties have done. I mean, particularly in 1986, as everybody knows. Which is why I think the other elements in this bill are positive. I think they could be certainly much improved, but positive in the sense that they are a bit more flexible than in the past in terms of the number of people for the different categories that will be allowed. By flexible, I mean that they allow for the raising of some of these caps depending on what the economy demands. I still think it's rigid, but the issue is, I mean, just to give you an example, between the 40s and 60s, there was a guest worker program called Bracero. It was mostly agricultural, but that's really the kinds of workers that were needed at the time and that wanted to come to the U.S. at the time anyway. And the program was so effective that illegal immigration dropped to really negligible levels at the time. That ended in the 1960s, and then this whole problem that we have now kind of probably originated there. So let's learn from that experience. I mean, if we have a system, a guest worker program, or a plurality of guest worker programs that are flexible enough to reflect the real needs of the economy, then we won't get significant numbers of illegal immigrants at all. In which case, I'm sure people will not object at all to legalizing those who are already here. The people who worry about that, I think, generally are very worried about the fact that they may legalize 11 or 12 million people now, and then they will have to come back to the table 10, 15 years from now and then discuss how to legalize another 5, another 10. That's what people don't want. Well, the way to get rid of that possibility is just to go back to some kind of guest worker program that's really open and flexible enough to reflect the needs of the economy, rather than attempts by legislators to legislate the future and just anticipate what needs the economy will have, 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I'm a strong believer in the free market system, and I always felt that if a company wants to hire individuals to do work for them, they should be able to go to wherever they feel necessary. And I'm not a huge believer in protectionism either. Now, of course, when it comes to national security issues, that's a different story. Yeah. But I believe that the federal government should stay out of a lot of this and let business do what they think is best for the benefit of their businesses and their shareholders and their customers. And I think what you said plays into that a little more than some of the things that we've heard coming from Washington, D.C. Alvaro, I want to thank you so much for spending some the time with us, and I congratulate you on this book and this project that you've worked on. And I think it's been an enjoyable discussion, and I'd love to bring you back to pick up on this, especially if we get a little bit of news on where the immigration bill is headed, and if we end up with a bill, if we don't end up with a bill, wherever that ends up playing out.
Well, sure. I'd love to come back. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Yeah, one last question. Where could folks get a copy of your book?
It's in bookstores, on Amazon. Our website, you can get it there as well. It's at www.independent.org. Okay.
And also I see something, globalcrossingsbook.com?
That's right, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Well, again, Alvaro Vargas Llosa, who is the Senior Fellow with the Independent Institute and also the author of this great book, Global Crossings, Immigration, Civilization, and America. Thank you again for joining us on the Final Say radio show, and best of luck to you.